So you said at the beginning, when you were diagnosed with your illness, you started a lot of emotional avoidance also. So in addition to perfectionism, emotional avoidance really probably caused your burnout and created suffering for you. How have you shifted your relationship with feelings?
Yeah, so this is like maybe one of the biggest themes for me, and one of the things I'm most thankful for getting out of psychotherapy, and that is just the idea that I think the being raised in kind of like a blue collar family, that where kind of masculinity was a very important thing to some of the male figures in my life, and that masculinity, fairly narrowly construed, was as well, made it such that I think that I didn't develop the emotional vocabulary that some people get the opportunity to develop as children, because certain emotions like fear, sadness, things like that were not necessarily acceptable emotions in the family that I grew up in, and even in the kind of in the culture that I grew up in. But anger was just fine in my house and in my town, as a means of kind of, you're either happy or you're angry, basically. Were the two easiest modes for a lot of the folks that I was around growing up. So I think, of course, I didn't know any of this at the time. I was really in it, so I wasn't able to access it rationally. But one of the things that was really key, and I started to realize this after I started to see you and my last therapist, was this idea that that first of all, when I feel angry, because it's not like, the process is like, if something makes me sad, it's not like I'll just ignore it and not feel anything. What I'll do is I'll transmute it into anger. And so somehow I was able to get a hold of that process, um, and start to see that more often. And it really started, I think, with tracking when I'm feeling angry. Just that's been my most useful pattern for therapy, is, hear about a concept, commit to looking for it, being curious about it in my own life, and then, kind of coming back with what I find out, and usually something will come up from somebody else, or from you, that suggests a different way of thinking about it, that makes things more helpful. So for me, with all of this, I started to realize that, like, oh, sadness is really hard for me. I watched some Netflix show about this too. Apparently, men and sadness, women and anger. These two things. Society doesn't like those two things together. So I watched that Netflix documentary, and boy, was that helpful. Just to see that lots of men are turning sadness into anger. And so I was able to start looking out for anger, because I'd get angry every now and then, and really angry sometimes, especially while shopping, and I'd get angry at people I was working with, and I found that this case building thing was a big part of it. First of all, that I would just be saying all these things in my head, like, oh, like, she knows she's wasting our time here, like, why is she spending forever looking at this, and just really not the best self-talk in terms of getting in touch with what was really going on. But more often, more and more often, I would be able to see this process and get out in front of it a little bit, and acknowledge the actual emotions that might be there. So now for me, when I feel angry, my first move is to be like, well, what is it really? And sometimes it's anger. You've given me, at least a checkbox of things where anger, is the appropriate response, right? So if someone's violating boundaries, or, being rude or insulting or something like that, yeah, anger is probably the appropriate response. But I'd still say, I don't encounter a whole lot of those things in my life, but I still have, it's still easy for me to go to anger, but it doesn't burn as brightly anymore, because, I'm able to get ahead of that case building process, and I'm able to reflexively say, okay, this is anger, or I'm feeling angry, but what is it really? And, up until a year or two ago, I think the number of times in my life that I have said internally or externally, I am sad or I am scared, probably 10 times each maximum for, 30 some years of my life. I literally never said or thought those things.
All of that was very good. Just to mirror some stuff back to you and talk about some of the concepts that you're describing. With the case building, that's if catastrophic thinking is to anxiety, then building a case is to anger. So one way to know that you're experiencing anger is you notice that you're building a case. So you're thinking about all the things that the other person is doing wrong. So thank you for using that term. I think your use of psychotherapy is a great example that basically what you're saying is you heard about a concept, you self-monitored, you look for that, you heard about a concept like anger, you then looked for it in your everyday life, you got data about it, you brought it back to group, we talked about it as a group, I offered things, other people offered things. You got a new perspective, and then you started to add that into your life, and then you even came up with new self-talk like what else might be going on rather than this feeling, and now that feeling doesn't have the same power over you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just getting more comfortable again. I've seen, there's these versions of therapy that I've seen on TV where, someone's afraid of flying or afraid of a dog or, afraid of dogs. And, what they'll do is first they bring the dog into the room and then, and after, 10 iterations of this, eventually the person's petting a dog, this person who has had a lifelong, like terrified reaction to dogs. I feel that's so for those emotions of mine, where literally the first time I talked about being scared or sad in therapy was the 11th time in my life I had ever done that. Like getting closer and closer to the scary emotion, but not going overboard. Desensitizing myself to the learning that these emotions aren't that bad. They kind of don't feel great, but they are not. They're not going to come with a lot of social sanction like they would have when I was a kid in my household or among my peers. Like nobody's going to yell at so learning that those emotions were safe to have has been really helpful. Of course, these are very old habits, and especially with fear, it's hard for me to not run from that feeling and avoid it.
Yes, I agree with you on everything, especially how psychotherapy in and of itself can be exposure to emotion. And I think that you've used it really well. And the way that you described that was really great. In awareness of our time, why don't we close here and then come back to fear? I know there's a number of different skills that we've kind of worked on together to relate to fear more effectively. So does that sound like a good place to pick up?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Jim, so much for your time.
Yep.